kahi, he mihi māku ki tō tātou nei mātua I te rangi, nāna nei nā me katoa I pū mai nāna hoki I tango kauroria ki tō ingo tapu. Kia mātou, ki tō mātou nei mate I tēnei wāhana o te tau o matariki o puanga, kia koutou rā haere, oki atu. Kia tātou nei te huna ora, tātou e noho ana I raro I te maru o maunga tere, I raro I te wai o wai makariri, ki ngā tai o mahanui, tēnā hoki tātou katoa, nau mai, hara mai, he hītaka katoa hau kia kite I a koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. Kia ora everyone, my name is Christina and I'm the Associate Dean Māori and Laura Lee has asked me to say a brief mihi to you or to welcome you tonight on this cold winter night. And I'd like to acknowledge, normally the person doing this would be Te Māori no Lenahan, who's our Potiaki, and he's from Naituahuriri, but he's away overseas at this moment. So you've got me. And normally, Suze or Te Māori no, when they would be doing this, they finish their mihi with a waiata. And I was trying to think of a waiata that aligned with our kaupapa of mental health, AI, psychedelics, and your brain. And I sort of thought of The Doors, which was probably written with the help of psychedelics. And I don't know if you want that. So we actually have a waiata about our university, o tākou whakaihu waka. And if you'll forgive me, I'll say the last couple of lines. It's just about our identity as a university. And it goes, Wahia te awa putaitua, ki te karamata o angitu e, ko taku tuakiritanga, ko taku kutuakiritana, ko o tākau whakaihu waka e tau nei. Kia ora mai tātou katoa.
Ko ahu e manutaki o tāku waki ihu waka I o tutati nei. Tēnei koutou katoa. So my name is Lutz Beckert. This is my first role as dean here and at Christchurch and head of campus. And as you worked out by now, I've recently sampled some healthcare in our own hospital. I decided to rupture not my Achilles tendon, as many people do, but my quadriceps tendon, which the surgeons very kindly reattached again. They told me it will all be fine soon. He also worked out that sort of I didn't grow up in the northern hemisphere. I grew up I didn't grow up in the southern hemisphere. I grew up in the northern hemisphere. And I also just like to acknowledge Matariki as sort of one of the bits which connects many cultures. One of the oldest paintings has identified the what we call here Matariki star connection. It's in the Bible as a sign of winter, as a sign of grieving. It connects Japanese culture, and it is really us acknowledging it's a time of winter, a time of renewal, a time to think about people who have passed. And thank you very much for everybody coming out, braving the cold, braving the dark, and I will sit down and listen in to the wisdom of my colleagues and hand over to Lorelei. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lutz. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Laurelie Mason aho. Hello, everybody. My name's Laurelie Mason. I'm the Communications Advisor here at the University of Otago, Christchurch, this wonderful campus. Thank you all for coming. As Lutz said, a cold night, but a better night than we had 2 weeks ago. We had rain for the first public talk. That one was based on the heart. Tonight, we're turning it to the head. Mental health is what we're all about this evening. We're here to sort of celebrate the wonderful research and clinical research mahi and work that's going on in this campus. It continues to amaze me. I've been here nearly 4 years now, how much incredible work goes on with the researchers on this campus. We absolutely bet above our weight, none more so than in the Department of Psychological Medicine, where all our speakers come from this evening. A little bit about mental health, a lot of you will know. You know, the statistics are worrying, aren't they? A study published 2 months ago shows that mental health is identified by Kiwis as the #1 health issue in New Zealand. with over half of us rating mental health as our biggest health concern. The 2022-23 New Zealand Health Survey showed about 1 in 3 adults had experienced symptoms of anxiety or depression in the previous fortnight. That's up from 1 in 4 in the previous survey 8 years earlier. There are more children and teens now, of course, experiencing mental health, whether it be social media, other factors. 1 in 4 adults now report having a moderate to high problematic substance abuse. That figure also is on the rise. And as far as mental well-being goes, worryingly, New Zealand rates itself, well, the people in the surveys, 36 out of 36 countries for mental well-being. That's a bit of a worry. Why is this? Well, it's multifactorial as all these things are. The lingering health effects in this city alone of the quakes, March 17, COVID, of course. It's also inequities, inequalities of income, access to good housing, cost of living, the pressures we have of daily life. But on the good side, of course, the stigma of shame for mental health is lifting, far more so than we'll all remember from our childhoods 20 years ago. It just wasn't spoken of. Not much was done. Now we've got the likes of the John Kerwins, the Mike Kings, the Matt Chisholms, stepping forward, telling their own stories, encouraging others to seek help. We've also got government policy, that there's been a bit of a catch-up with that, finally, in treating mental health and giving it the money that's required. We don't have enough staff, of course, as yet, but we're not alone in that in this country. And workplace policies, too, have stepped up in recent years, acknowledging people require support in the workplace. Hence, there's a renewed focus on and a commitment to researching mental health. It's a growing and exciting field of medicine. So not only examine the causes, but to predict the triggers, develop novel drug treatments in areas we've never looked into before, such as psychedelics. The prospective use of AI in the future and where that's heading. The continued development of non-drug treatments, alike to the CBT and the BAT. And there's a growing understanding and acceptance now that a combination of both drugs and talk therapy, the CBTs, is the way forward for most people. In the next hour, we're going to hear from 4 leading researchers and clinicians from our Department of Psychological Medicine. They're going to delve into all these fabulous areas of research. Associate Professor Ben Beaglehole, Associate Professor Katie Douglas, Associate Professor James Foulds, and Dr. Matthew Tennant. I'd like to first introduce and have a quick chat about the first speaker. Associate Professor Ben Beaglehole, he's a psychiatrist who works in the anxiety disorders service, at Te Whare Ora, Canterbury. He gained his medical degree at Otago University and completed psychiatric specialist training here in Christchurch. He's also a key senior lecturer and researcher here in the department on this campus, and his research projects are focused on examining the longer-term outcome of mood disorders and interventions to increase the likelihood of response and remission. He also researches the psychological effects of natural disasters and trauma, and medical legal aspects of psychiatry, such as compulsory treatment orders. Ben is currently recruiting for a Health Research Council-funded study to evaluate the use of low-dose oral ketamine combined with behavioural activation therapy, BAT, for drug-resistant depression. It's one of a number of psychedelics now being looked at for the treatment of depression in those who don't necessarily respond to first-line treatment. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Laurelie. Kia ora koutou. Ko Ben Beaglehole takaingoa. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be a psychiatrist. There's a bunch of new medications and brain stimulation treatments on the horizon. And although these offer a lot of promise, I'm also concerned that some of them are being overhyped. And that's why I've titled my talk as I have. Back in the 1990s, George W. Bush designated the decade of the brain. And this stimulated a lot of funding and research trying to address difficult to treat dementias and mental health problems. But by the end of the decade, despite all that hard work, there wasn't much tangible that had changed. We had look-alike medications that were close relatives of previous medications. Perhaps there were less side effects, but in terms of efficacy, there weren't major advances. And I guess I'm posing the question, are things beginning to change now? You've probably seen headlines about psychedelic medications. Even this week, Minister Seymour announced that an experienced psychiatrist, just one in the country, is now able to prescribe psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Now, that's not me. But I think, despite all this flurry of interest, I am concerned that some of these things are overhyped. And so a lot of the interest is in psychedelics. What are psychedelics? Well, these are substances that change how we think and feel and perceive the world. And in layman terms, people are having a trip when they take psychedelics. They may well be hallucinating, time may speed up, colours may change in intensity. And it's a reversible experience for most. So you take a psychedelic, you have a trip for a number of hours and then it passes. The psychedelics are substances that have been known to mankind for a long time. So in indigenous cultures and all around the world, there's been use of peyote, that's cactus. There's been use of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. But some of them are also chemicals that have been designed in the lab. And initially they were designed to mimic psychosis, the type of mental illness that is characteristic of schizophrenia, as a way of exploring antipsychotic medications. And as far back as the 60s, they were being explored for their therapeutic potential. And then President Nixon declared a war on drugs, and that line of research stopped suddenly. So the therapeutic investigation of psychedelics stopped in the early 70s for decades, and then there's been a resurgence more recently. So what might psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy look like? Typically, each individual that receives it is allocated 2 therapists, and they spend 6 or 8 hours preparing the person for their psychedelic experience. If it's magic mushrooms or psilocybin that's under investigation, when you take that substance, you're going to trip for 6 or 8 hours. So it's quite an arduous process. Spotify put out playlists to support and facilitate the psychedelic experience that's happening when you're taking psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And the 2 therapists are sitting there facilitating the process, and then once that is ended, there's a number more hours of post-dose integration. Now, if anybody's tried to see somebody from specialist mental health services and experienced our wait list, you'll realise that this is not going to be an easily transformable intervention. It's such a staff and time-intensive process that I don't think it's going to fit well with public services. It may fit better in the private system, but it's going to cost you many thousands of dollars to receive it. As well as the challenge with translating a treatment like this into the public system, I think there's some other reasons to doubt how effective it will eventually turn out to be. In a medical experiment, when you're trying to understand if a treatment is effective, you want to randomly allocate half the group of people to receive placebo, an inert substance, and half the people receive the active treatment. Well, just imagine a psilocybin study. Half the people are sitting there twiddling their thumbs for 6 or 8 hours, feeling disappointed that they haven't received the active treatment, and the other half are hallucinating. And you should ask yourself, what is the impact of that? Does positive beliefs about psilocybin being effective and receiving it add to the good outcomes with psilocybin, and do negative beliefs about not receiving the active treatment contribute to poorer outcomes in the placebo group. My colleagues and I also see people who've had difficult tripping experiences, admittedly not in clinical trials, but in my work in the anxiety disorder service, I've seen people with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of bad LSD trips. We've also seen people who a bad trip is a harbinger of a psychotic illness. So this treatment won't be for everybody. I'm not trying to dismiss this line of work at all. I think it offers a lot of promise. I've been involved in researching a related substance called ketamine. Those of us who walk in certain walks of life will know of ketamine as vitamin K, a party drug. The vets amongst us will know of it as a horse tranquilizer. It's been a medication that's been around for many years, mostly used by ambulance officers and emergency departments to dissociate people from their pain. There's just much more evidence to support the use of ketamine. That's why I'm more positive about ketamine. There's many randomized controlled studies supporting the finding that ketamine is helpful for treatment-resistant depression. There's a bunch of other studies that support its use for other disorders. Already in New Zealand, S-ketamine, essentially ketamine, is available and licensed to be prescribed alongside a new antidepressant. Unfortunately, it's very costly because the old drug ketamine has been tweaked slightly and given a drug company an opportunity to make a lot of money. And so although it's licensed for use in New Zealand, it's not yet funded, and it's an expensive treatment. One of the things about ketamine that's important to know is that you can inject it. And I've done this on many occasions and given people a trip. It only lasts about an hour. But you can also take it orally and slow its absorption down to minimize the trip. And this is where I think it offers promise. Some will say, is the trip important in the therapeutic effects of ketamine? And I think the evidence suggests that people improve even if you minimize the trip. And so that's why I think ketamine offers a lot of promise. Both ketamine and psilocybin work on the brain. Each of them act on different receptors, but at the final point of the pathway, perhaps they're resulting in neurogenesis or neuroplasticity. Perhaps they're helping neurons form new connections and allowing new brain cells to work. This is why they're theorized to help depression. And so in Otago, we've completed studies looking at ketamine for treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, for treatment-resistant OCD, and and treatment-resistant depression. We've explored the use of oral ketamine when we try and minimize the trip to see if the therapeutic benefits are maintained. And we're currently doing a study where we're exploring the addition of psychotherapy to ketamine to see if we can prolong the positive benefits of ketamine. And that's the key challenge with ketamine. We know it works well in the short term, but mental health problems are long-term difficulties. So we're trying to see if we can extend the short-term benefits of ketamine treatment with psychotherapy. That study's ongoing. We're due to start a similar study looking at oral ketamine for bipolar disorder, for bipolar depression. So I've touched upon the difficulties with blinding, making it hard for people to tell if they're receiving the active substance, psilocybin, or in this case, ketamine, or the control medication. You know, this is still a problem with the ketamine research as well. And the way we've approached this is to give everybody a course of ketamine and randomize people to receive psychotherapy or not in our latest study. Where are the ways forward in this area? I've raised my concerns about how translatable the psilocybin treatment will be. I think oral dosing of substances is one way forward, and perhaps microdosing of substances like psilocybin and LSD and MDMA, ecstasy. Maybe these will offer us some useful treatments into the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. Associate Professor Katie Douglas, it's her turn now. Thank you. Katie gained both her Bachelor of Science honours and later her PhD here at Otago. She's a Research Associate Professor in our campus's Department of Psychological Medicine, as well as being a registered clinical psychologist. Katie's been awarded 7 major research grants as Principal Investigation, including the prestigious Sir Charles Hurkis Fellowship from the Health Research Council of New Zealand in 2018. She's currently leading an innovative trial of group-based cognitive remediation in mood disorders, and she too has a research interest in behavioural activation therapy, BAT, and whether it may be effective in treating bipolar disorder. Her other research interests focus on the impacts of earthquake-related PTSD and the influence of childhood trauma on mental health. She's involved in a Health Research Council-funded project aimed at helping teens who ruminate and overthink with brain training techniques. And Katie is a Deputy Chair of the Australasian Society of Bipolar and Depressive Disorders and supervises several PhD students here in areas of cognitive functioning and mood and anxiety disorders. Welcome, Katie.
Kia ora koutou. Today I'd like to start with a show of hands. If anyone has ever experienced a single thought or a single train of thought that has ended up looking something like this. Show of it, yeah, that. No one up here put their hands up. It's a really common experience to experience messy, circular, kind of overthinking processes and feeling a bit lost in our thoughts. Some people experience that type of thinking almost constantly, and if it's always negatively focused, then it can have a really big impact on your mental health, and particularly on depression. The people who I work with, who a lot of whom have depression, describe this kind of negative overthinking in lots of really interesting ways. So some people talk about their minds feeling like busy, noisy train stations. Some people feel like their mind's like a overflowing email inbox where they're constantly getting new notifications and new emails that are only partially read. And someone more recently talked about their mind just feeling like this kind of loud static of fragmented thoughts. And he just wanted to be able to turn that static down. There's a technical word for this type of negative, repetitive overthinking, and it's called rumination, which isn't the chewing of cud like cows do. In a psychological perspective, it's chewing over your negative thoughts repeatedly. And today I'm going to be talking about why we're interested in rumination and what we can do about it from a mental health perspective. So first of all, some definitions. We know by nature that rumination is negative. So when people ruminate, they're often thinking about bad things that are happening in their lives, or past failures or past mistakes that they've made, as opposed to self-reflection, which is a more balanced way of thinking about past successes and failures. We also know that rumination is repetitive, so it feels like a broken record that just keeps going round and round. And people experience rumination as uncontrollable, so they feel it's really, really hard to unhook yourself from a ruminative train of thought. So if we go back to that email inbox analogy that I mentioned at the start, it's like your head's email, your workplace email, where you're constantly getting new notifications about the mistakes that you've made or the people you've let down, and people just cannot silence that. I think this quote captures what rumination is very well. So it's a passive comparison of one's current situation with some unachieved standard. And often people have standards that they've set for themselves, often in relation to how they perceive how good or successful other people are going. And this is where social media is particularly unhelpful. We also know from a research perspective that rumination is a depressant. So when people are in a ruminative cycle, their mood is going to drop. And we can see that from all sorts of different experimental procedures. And it's not surprising when you look at the types of thoughts that people are clinging on to and kind of repeating over and over again. We often know that people kind of take themselves away to be alone, to start trying to problem solve these questions that they're asking themselves. But these questions are not easily answered, so you end up in that kind of jumbled mess that I showed at the start. People also have this type of tunnel vision when they're ruminating, where they are so internally focused and thinking about these thoughts going on that they lose track of actually what's going on around them, and they lose track of their external environment. I was going to ask at this point if anyone could raise their hand if they've also had the experience of driving somewhere and getting there and then realising you actually have no idea how you got there or completely forgot the trip. So that's also a very common kind of autopilot phenomenon, and often that is because we're just completely immersed in our own thinking that we've lost track of what's going on around. So we also know in the longer term that rumination links with depression really strongly. So it's actually one of the most strong psychological risk factors for depression and for anxiety. And that means that if you're someone who tends to ruminate, you're much more likely to get depressed or anxious in the future. We also know that when you're going through a depressive episode, if you tend to ruminate, that often prolongs the episode or makes it harder to get out of. So it's called a maintaining or a perpetuating factor. On top of that, we also know in depression that when people are going through a depressive episode, there's things going on in your brain which make it harder to actually perform the day-to-day tasks you need to be able to perform. And these brain-based functions are called cognitive functions. So when people are going through a depressive episode, they have problems, for example, with sustaining attention. So often the people who I work with find it hard to even read a single sentence, let alone a book. It affects ability to lay down memories, so it's hard to learn new information or hold information online while you're processing it. Or it can also affect your ability to shift flexibly your attention between different things. So obviously that makes it really hard for people to be keeping on working in cognitively demanding jobs when they're in a depressive episode. But these cognitive functions or these impaired cognitive functions also make it really hard to disengage from the rumination. So I hope the message I've hammered home so far is the fact that rumination links really strongly with low mood. And then on top of that, if you have these cognitive problems as well, it makes it even harder to actually unhook from rumination and disengage from it. And that can lead to a really strong cycle of rumination and depression. So this takes me to a new type of intervention that has been trialled internationally. It's new in terms of the research base. So actually, it's only been researched for about 10 years, which is very new for an intervention. It's called cognitive control training, which has been developed specifically to target rumination and depression. And essentially, it involves repetitive computerized cognitive practice, usually for only a few weeks. 1 or 2 times a day. And it's trying to train the cognitive processes that are involved in rumination to teach people to disengage from that by being able to shift their attention or keep their attention on something else other than rumination. So we're developing a treatment here in Christchurch called Cognitive Control Training Aotearoa, or COCA, which people have told me is not a great name because it sounds more like a substance use intervention. But essentially what this is a 2-week short-term brain training intervention, which we're getting, at the moment we're getting university students to practice 1 to 2 times a day. And I'm just going to show a wee video, which is risky, I know, because it might not work, but this is a glimpse of what the task actually looks like. Actually, I should explain the task because you might not quite be able to see the numbers on the screen, but the task is called the Adaptive Paced Auditory Serial Addition task, which is a real mouthful. Essentially, someone's saying numbers to you, and you have to keep adding the last 2 numbers that you hear. There's groans already, and I haven't even played it. So I'll give you a demo of what it involves.
Welcome to today's brain training exercise. Please sit in a quiet place where you're unlikely to get distracted. Remember, this task is supposed to challenge your attention. The more effort you put in, the more you'll get out of the training. Kia kaha. 1. 8.
So you'd say 9.
5.
And then 13, I think.
9. 7. 7. 8. 5.
But I can hear some secret competitiveness going on in there. So you can see this is not ketamine, this is not an exciting intervention. But that's kind of the beauty of it, that it's actually really not that fun to do, but it's really hard and challenging, and that's what we need to be able to train our attention. In multiple sclerosis, this type of task has been used to study cognition, and in a study of MS patients, they actually said they'd prefer to get a lumbar puncture over do this task. So that's why the coaching sessions are also important. You need to have a nice therapist or a nice research assistant coaching you through and encouraging you to keep trying. Because actually, as I said, the beauty is in the challenge. And actually, as people go through the 2-week period, it does become easier. And people do actually notice effects in other areas of their life. So the trial that we're doing at the moment is called an open label trial. So that means that everyone who enters the trial gets the intervention. So we're currently recruiting people based in Christchurch, so the university students who endorse really high levels of rumination. And then they go through this 2-week COCA intervention and get research assessments done before and after, and then 6 weeks after that to see whether the effects of COCA are durable over time. So at the moment, we've got 15 students, so it's a small trial at the moment, but the findings actually look really encouraging. So what we're seeing, and this is what is found internationally as well, that there's a very significant drop in rumination over the course of the 2 weeks, but that keeps on going at 6 weeks, and the same for depression symptoms. So it's thought that these cognitive functions that people are persisting with over the 2-week intervention are actually able to then let them disengage from rumination in their day-to-day life. And I know that these graphs don't have any context behind them, but the drops that you're seeing here would be suggestive that people are really experiencing quite big drops that they'd notice in their day-to-day life. So we're encouraged by these findings, and we're hoping with funding to be able to run a larger scale trial of this intervention. So for those of you who don't want to do the exercise or don't want to sign up for the COCA trial, there are other ways that you can actually set up your life so that you can try and get the same effects in terms of being able to get more cognitive control. The first is sleep, which I haven't mentioned at all, but sleep is basically the first and major building block that you need for cognitive function, but also for depression or for maintaining mood. So basically getting consistent, stable sleep will take you a long way along this spectrum of getting cognitive control already. There's also things you can do in your day-to-day life that just make things more cognitively stimulating. And I know in this day and age, you can rely on basically everything on your phone, which makes us a wee bit cognitively lazy, or it makes us kind of avoid these cognitively challenging tasks. But actually, if you think about training your brain, just like you train your physical health by going to the gym, there's things you can do to try and make sure you can keep sustained attention and train your attention to be able to shift to different things. So if you looked up, going back to Spotify, like Ben mentioned, there's all sorts of attention training techniques on Spotify that walk you through this technique that has also been found to be effective in reducing rumination. So it's called an attention training technique, but even without Spotify, you can do this. For example, with some of my patients, I tell them to listen to a piece of music and then switch between listening to the melody for a minute, then maybe the bass line for a minute, and then maybe the drums for a minute, and being able to keep kind of training by dividing and shifting your attention between different noises is essentially what attention training is. There's also lots of brain training apps that are available. One that I would recommend would be called Lumosity, which has got a research base behind it. So these, and they're probably slightly more enjoyable than the tasks that we're testing in the COCA trial. So I'd like to finish by thanking the research team who's helping to run the COCA trial at the moment. And I'll pass on to the next speaker. Well, Laura Lee.
Lovely, thanks. Thanks, Katie. As I mentioned before, when I introduced the wrong order, I've numbered my pages wrong. So it's completely I need to train my brain into numbering pages properly, I think, for these talks. As mentioned, James did his medical degree, James Foulds, at Otago, and he returned to Christchurch in 2008, and he's worked as a consultant psychiatrist and here and on the West Coast. He's a co-convener of fourth-year medical student teaching here on campus in addiction medicine. His research interests include the epidemiology of alcohol use, particularly in relation to mental health comorbidity and the treatment of alcohol-related mental illness. Now, many of you will have heard of the Dunedin study. We have our own taonga here in Christchurch called the Christchurch Health and Development Study, CHDS. It's an equal taonga to us. It's a wonderful study. James is a director of the CHDS here on campus. It's a long-term, world-renowned longitudinal research project tracking the health, education and life progress of over 1,200 Christchurch people from 1977. The cohort are now aged 48, and since infancy, the cohort's been followed through every stage of their lives. Over the decades, the CHDS has the cohort has allowed the production, of more than 570 scientific papers on many aspects of these people's lives, their health and their well-being. And it's helped contribute to significant social and government policy changes as well. Using this data, James and his team have been able to provide a picture of many mental health illnesses and aspects of the brain and how they develop in some people over a lifetime. And the ADHD, of course, has been followed as well. Talk about that, James. Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Kia ora koutou, and thank you for your welcome, Laura Lee, also Christina and Lutz. So the best time to plant a tree is 50 years ago, and the next best time really would be today. And so the best time to start a major life course study would be 50 years ago. And fortunately, some wise people within the university had the forethought to do that. And so what I'm going to do is talk briefly an overview about life course research and Otago's two world-renowned life course research studies, of which the Christchurch study is the one that I'm involved with. And I'm going to use that as a lens through which to talk about how one might study ADHD outcomes and what that would tell us. And also just want to highlight that the government has recently signalled its recognition of the importance of this line of research by committing to funding for both the Christchurch study and the Dunedin study, which are now pretty close partners. So the University of Otago is pretty unique worldwide in having two internationally acclaimed landmark life course studies. And what's unique about life course studies is that they allow us to explore how events that happened in the distant past shape human experience and development in the present and into the future. And they're particularly good at showing how both genes and early environment experiences are influential on health and developmental outcomes throughout life. So the Dunedin study was the first off the blocks. Just over 1,200 people born in Dunedin in 1974, with a really remarkable and unprecedented retention rate of about 90% up to age 45, and they're currently most of the way through their age 52 data gathering phase. So the Christchurch Health and Development Study is about to turn 50, which is pretty exciting. The Christchurch study has some unique strengths and really complements the Dunedin study in terms of what it's looked at. And particularly its measurements of the early family environment are really highly regarded worldwide as being pretty groundbreaking. And I think that much of that is down to the foresight of this man, Professor David Ferguson, who those of us that knew him, I didn't know him particularly well. He walked the corridors where I worked, and he was quite a dominating presence, but really often described as a force of nature and very prescient in the way that he approached his leadership of the study over a number of years. So this is a snapshot of some of the things that the study has done. So really a very narrow kind of set of examples, but 1980, so swimming pool fencing. Nowadays we don't really think twice about the fact that pools are fenced, but the study sort of shone light on that, the fact there was lots of swimming pools and many of them risked young people falling in them. Environmental lead exposure. So the study collected teeth in exchange for small tokens for the study members who wrote to the David Ferguson, who they saw as the tooth fairy. They still recount those stories even now. And that showed that environmental lead exposure had lasting impacts on cognitive functioning, leading to the elimination of lead from petrol. Long-term effects of childhood abuse has been really a consistent theme through the study. Of course, the mental health effects of the earthquakes. The study was kind of a natural experiment in the sense that about half the population was living outside Christchurch and half were within it at the time of the earthquakes. And we now have this opportunity to look at another wave of data gathering in 2026 and beyond. And these are some of the things that we're intending on looking at. So focusing on women's health, looking at the eye as a window into the brain, looking at some baseline measurements of aging, repeating some of the things that we've done from the past, and looking at cardiovascular health. So I want to briefly talk about ADHD and how we might use life course research to understand what happens when kids with ADHD grow up. And there's increasing recognition of the impact of neurodiversity, both in positive terms and in terms of causing difficulties in life. This has really come about in the last 10 or 20 years, just much more acceptance and recognition of the spectrum of neurodiversity, including ADHD, dyslexia, autistic spectrum disorders, dyspraxia, and so on. And much of that recognition has come through the courage of high-profile people who've talked about their own experiences, both positive and negative. So I'm sure most of you would recognise these people. So Jamie Oliver, Anika Moa, Richard Branson, Jim Carrey, Simone Biles, and Bill Gates. And Richard Branson in particular is a pretty fascinating character and has really promoted the idea of both sort of dyslexic thinking as a strength and source of creativity and energy and drive, and has also talked about the likelihood of him having ADHD as a kid, although that was never formally diagnosed or treated. So ADHD is a common genetically influenced condition that affects the brain and behaviour. And traditionally, as psychiatrists, we were taught that this was something that affected kids. Maybe it carried on a bit into the teenage years. And essentially you grew out of it. And that assumption's increasingly being challenged. There is a lot of publicity in mainstream media and academic journals now about the impact of adult ADHD, and probably many of us would know people in our own social circles who have either been recently diagnosed or informally diagnosed themselves with ADHD. So the main core features are problems with attention and focus. These are people that they lose things, they're forgetful, they they might get through 1 or 2 bits of a task and then they go off on another tangent. They're overactive and restless, so they might be the kids that are, up and looking out the window in the classroom, or climbing, or walking around disrupting other students. They might also have impulse control problems. There's a number of other dimensions, including mood problems, often substance use, and other conduct issues that go along with it. And one of the key things about ADHD is it's treatable with medication. And so in theory, at least, if it can be effectively diagnosed, you can apply treatment and you can alter the outcomes. So we were interested, given the idea that people with ADHD may achieve very well in their life, they may have differences in their thinking that could actually be advantageous for them, but also knowing through our clinical experience that many people with ADHD had difficulties, we wanted to look at this. And life course research is an ideal platform for exploring these kind of questions. So in the Christchurch study, ADHD was measured pretty comprehensively at age 14 to 16 with self-report, parent report, and teacher feedback. And that allowed us to identify those within the cohort, which was initially just over 1,200 and now almost 1,000 retained in the adult waves, and to look at how they were functioning in early adulthood. And the other thing, I guess, about life course research is the ability to not only look at the predictor or exposure you're interested in and the outcomes, but also to look at other factors in the early environment that might obscure or confound those connections between the two things that you're mostly interested in. So this is in brief what we found was that kids with ADHD at age 14 to 16 had modest increases long-term in their rates of substance use problems, of criminal offending, mental health problems. Their relationships were poorer in quality, so they had more changes in relationships, less satisfaction in relationships. They had lower overall income, and they were less likely to have home ownership. So what this indicated to us is that while clearly ADHD and associated neurodiversity can be a real strength for many people and allows you to approach problems differently, for many others it can actually cause significant long-term problems. And instead of what was traditionally seen as being a childhood-limited condition, it's pretty clear that many of these people have persisting problems into adulthood. So I think what that says is that we need to identify these people and follow them up. There needs to be a low threshold for treatment, and that workplaces, education providers, and other parts of society need to be aware and accommodate these people. So looping back to what we're planning for our next wave of data collection is that we want to know to what extent these problems actually persist at age 50. Traditionally, something that was seen to be gone by 10 or 12 or 15, maybe this is actually a significant source of problems in midlife, particularly with the demands placed on us by social media, the internet, and all the other things that are monopolizing our attention. So stay tuned to find out.
Thank you very much, James. Right, on to our last speaker now, Dr. Matthew Tennant. Matthew gained his medical degree here at Otago University and completed his specialist training here as well. He's currently working to add a PhD to his qualifications. He's a psychiatrist here in Christchurch for Te Whatu Ora, Canterbury, providing inpatient and community mental health care. And he's also a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine here on campus, where he teaches and coordinates the 5th year psychiatric medicine course for the medical students. He assesses trainee interns and does postgraduate teaching, as well as teaching psychiatric registrars about the neurobiology of addiction. And he's also involved in the development of simulation training for psychiatric emergencies for junior doctors. He describes himself as very much an early career researcher, and his main areas of interest are bipolar and mood disorders, recovery and chronic mental illness, medical education and psychological ethics. Psychiatric ethics rather than psychological. Sorry, Matthew. He's also involved in applying grants at the moment. He's applying for grants in the use of AI to treat cognitive problems, using virtual reality characters to support people, for example, between psychiatric medical appointments. So hear more about that. Welcome, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. Oh, thank you for coming along tonight, everyone. I'm talking about AI in the treatment of mental illness and doing a little bit of future gazing with you. I think if I had heard about some of the projects I'd be beginning to be involved with now, a few years ago even, it would have sounded a little bit like science fiction to me. So I think the technology is progressing really quickly in this area and it's quite exciting. So tonight I'm going to initially address the question of AI and diagnosis, because I think the most common question I get asked is AI going to do you out of the job? So I'm going to try and look at that briefly. And then I'm going to introduce two studies which we're doing locally. One's around using AI avatars to support psychological therapy. The other's around using AI to help prediction in mood disorders. And finally, I'm going to try and take a step back and ask, just because we can do these things, should we be doing these things? So in this study, which was published earlier this year, different large language models, AI, were given clinical vignettes about people with mental illness. And the same vignettes were given to psychiatric registrars, so doctors beginning their training in psychiatry. And as you can see, the AI was actually better at picking up DSM diagnoses than the psychiatric registrars were. So at one level, AI already has more knowledge than doctors training in psychiatry. And yet when you had a look at what it was doing, AI models made more categorical errors. So what I mean by that is they would say something like someone has a unipolar depression and a bipolar depression together, whereas psychiatric registrars wouldn't make mistakes like that or made them less often, demonstrating that the registrars had a better fundamental understanding of what was actually going on rather than simple symptom recognition. However, they weren't as good at recognizing less common conditions. And so probably the best results were when psychiatric registrars were allowed to use AI models. And then they were able to access all the knowledge, but filter that through an understanding of the conditions themselves. And I think that that's likely the direction that we're going to go in as a specialty, where we're going to move to more hybrid models rather than AI or therapist. Already, AI avatars or chatbots have become increasingly realistic and immersive, and there's a huge boom of new services that have been developed in the private sector for mental health, and mostly they've been unevaluated, actually. And most of them have tried to replace a human therapist with an AI avatar or chatbot. In an innovative study that we're doing along with the University of Canterbury and a business called Soul Machine, we're evaluating the use of AI avatars as virtual supporters that work alongside a client and a human therapist. So in this scenario, a person still has therapy with a real human therapist. They may have therapy once a week or once a fortnight, But in addition to that, they have access to an AI avatar all of the time who's able to talk through difficulties with them, remind them about things that they've been discussing and working on in therapy, remind them about things that they may want to take to therapy with them. And then that AI supporter can sit in the therapy session with them and be a supporter, remind them of things that they wanted to say, and listen in to the therapist as well. The potential benefit of this is that it's completely accessible. You can talk to AI, you can pull out your phone whenever you want to, and spend as long as you want. And the therapist can help set the boundaries around what's done by that AI avatar. So there's a lot more control as well. So to test this out, what we've done is we've written 6 scenarios that cover common mental health difficulties, things like depression, anxiety, panic, grief, major change. And we're going to test out how the AI avatar handles conversations about those things. And we're going to do it in 2 ways. One, where we let the AI run free and say exactly what it wants when it wants. And another, where it has a real therapist okaying all of the speech. So reading what the avatar wants to say and saying, yep, that seems okay, that's okay, okay, I'll adapt that change. And so you can see in this picture, one person is talking in a room to the avatar, and in the another room, the therapist is seeing a video of the client and also of the avatar speaking to them. Now, we want to see how safe AI is in these situations. So we're adding some tricky, sensitive topics in, things like suicidality, addiction, domestic violence. And we're doing this initially with actors so that we can test out that safety before we're doing it with real clients. I'm going to show you a brief video of me chatting to the avatar, and this is when a therapist is modifying what the avatar says or okaying it, and you'll see that it's a little bit slower as a result of that.
Relationships are tough. What do you find helps, even just a little, when you're feeling this way?
Well, to be honest, I've been drinking quite a lot. That's probably the only thing at the moment that I'm doing to try and not feel it as much.
It's understandable to want to numb the pain, but it can sometimes make things harder in the long run. How do you feel about finding other ways to cope?
Okay, so what you can see there is that actually the answer that was given there was produced by AI, but it was slowed down quite significantly because there was a human reading it first and okaying it. And when that isn't the case, it's much more spontaneous. So it's going to be interesting to see how different it is having a human moderating or not, because obviously things flow much better actually when we're not trying to intervene. The second study I wanted to talk to you about is about predicting the course of mood episodes in bipolar disorder and major depressive disorders. Now Katie's already talked to us a bit about how mood disorders are a major cause of disability internationally, but particularly actually in New Zealand, where we have the leading incidence of bipolar disorder. And that's in part because of much higher prevalence rates of bipolar disorder in Maori communities and to a lesser extent Pacifica communities. And so this is an area of research that's really important in this country. Mood disorders are typically relapsing, remitting conditions. So what I mean by that is that people have episodes of depression or mania, and then they may have periods of relative stability in their mood for quite some time, but then may have another episode later on of depression or mania. One of the difficulties treating depression, and particularly bipolar depression, is that often people don't respond to the first treatment trial that they have. They may have to trial several different medications before finding an effective treatment. And we usually don't know whether someone's going to respond to a treatment for several weeks. And so that can lead to an agonizing wait for my patients, families, and for clinicians, not knowing whether the treatment that we've put in place is working. If we were able to predict earlier on whether a treatment was going to work, that would make a huge difference in the treatment of mood disorders. Now, we already know that the body's circadian rhythm, or natural sleep and activity rhythms, are strongly connected to mood disorders, and that they can drive and maintain episodes of mania and depression. And we have a pretty good way of measuring the body's sleep and activity patterns through actigraphy. So I've put a picture of an actigraph up there. That's one we'd use in clinical trials, although many of you will have Fitbits or smartwatches that might do this to perhaps a slightly less precise degree. The problem up until recently has been that these devices produce so much data that it is hard for humans to necessarily know how to find the patterns in it. And in this study, we're using machine learning, and so an AI technique, to help find patterns in the actigraphy of people who have depression or mania. And we're hoping that we will be able to find patterns that predict recovery before the clinical signs are evident to those people or the clinicians. It's part of a bigger international study. In Australia, they're recruiting people who are currently stable and asking them to wear actigraphs to try and predict when they're going to have an episode of mania or depression. And in India, we're trying to connect the patterns we're finding in actigraphy with biomarkers of the internal body clock. So those people are having blood tests taken 3 times a day to try and connect what's happening inside the body with what we're measuring with the actigraphy. Taking a step back with both of these studies and asking the question, just because we can, should we? You'll be aware that loneliness is a major problem within our society. And I do think that we have to, as a society, decide, is this the way that we want to fix this problem? To have more connections with AI compared to real human connections. I also think the perfection of a relationship with AI is a problem. I can ask ChatGPT questions any time of the day or night, and it will politely answer me whatever I want to know. It's always ready, it's never grumpy, it's never having a bad day. I can't treat my friends like that. And, you know, it's actually in imperfect relationships that I learn patience, I learn empathy, I learn to be less selfish. And I do wonder if substituting human relationships for AI relationships is losing something in that. Regarding prediction of relapse, we have to be careful that we're not perpetuating inequalities by accident. If we're using international big data sets or large language models, and then we're using them in New Zealand, we might inadvertently be giving someone treatment that works for the majority out there, but not necessarily for small ethnic and cultural minorities. So we have to be really intentional about the way that we introduce these tools and how we use them. I also think we have to be careful about whether people want to know this information. And, you know, if you knew that you had X% chance of having a depressive relapse, would that alter the risk? Might it in some way be a self-fulfilling prophecy? So I think we need to be wary of that, and the way that we get around that is that at each step in the development, we need to be including people, and we have, who have lived experience, and talking to them about, well, what would you want to know? And how could this help you? Rather than, is it interesting? So that's really important. On my final slide, I'll just finish by thanking the really big teams that work on these studies. We never work in isolation on these big projects, so thank you for everyone who's worked on these projects. And we'll probably wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Gosh, lots to think about there, isn't there? Thank you very much, Matthew. Look, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thanking our wonderful 4 speakers. We're just thrilled to have had you along. We know you've given up your time and we appreciate it.